Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show.
The human heart was the most unpredictable thing. Your best friend of many years might shield you from a sword, and then stab you in the chest the next minute. However, developing paranoia and being excessively suspicious of everything would be a huge disadvantage. Well, it would be impossible to make everyone sign a soul contract anyway. Well, there is no perfect system in this world, and since we know there are flaws, we will have to find ways to make up for it. However, the fairness of the contribution system is undeniable. The fair standards are exactly why our mages have faith in us, and are more driven to strive for better, said Pereira, who was the mage in charge of the pharmaceutical business, in a bid to give them an out. Lin Li did not make any comment about the conflict. Instead, he turned to look at Gavin, and calmly said, "Leave Kasana's matter aside. Go on, tell me what you found out." "Yes, Mr. President," said Gavin, who was less anxious after seeing that Lin Li was not angry. He continued, "After those potions and weapons appear on the market, we immediately conducted a series of investigations on the background of the business operators, and discovered that there is a wide network of forces that are involved." "Oh, how wide is it?" asked Lin Li, somewhat interested. "This is the list that we got through our investigations. To put it simply, it includes most of the forces in the breezy plains, apart from the forces in Duland. However, many of the various forces of different sizes are all connected. Hence, after we sorted it out, we could infer that the obstacles that we have faced in various aspects are likely to be caused by more than a dozen forces. Their names are at the top of the list." While speaking, Gavin handed a document to Lin Li, and then distributed the other copies to several other senior executives. "What? How? How is that possible?" the senior executives exclaimed in unison after taking a glance at the document, as it gave them a huge shock. Due to the fact that they were afraid of arousing the suspicion of others, Gavin had always been responsible for the investigation of the rival forces. He did not expose the details to the senior executives at all. Hence, the several senior executives did not know the exact severity of the issue, even though they knew that the Tower of Dusk was in serious trouble. After all, the last time Lin Li returned from the Sky Castle, he sent the mages of the Tower of Dusk to attack a group of unruly forces with their weapons. Although the focus of their attacks was on Duland City, the power exhibited by the Tower of Dusk managed to create a significant deterrence to the forces in other regions. The list of the forces in the breezy plains had clearly exceeded the psychological tolerance of the senior executives. The list meant that the enemy faced by the Tower of Dusk this time was not just a specific force, but almost half of the breezy plains. Indeed, the Tower of Dusk was developing rapidly, and also had extremely powerful capability. It had integrated the large and small forces of Duland and become the top power in the entire breezy plains. However, while the Tower of Dusk was powerful, compared to the individual forces, it did not mean that they could really fight the entire breezy plains. "Well, Mage Gavin, are you sure that this list is correct?" The senior executives hurriedly tried to verify the accuracy of the list. Although they knew that Gavin definitely wouldn't be careless in that aspect, they still couldn't help but hope that he got it wrong. They couldn't help panicking, because the 10 odd forces at the top of the list were not inferior to the Malfa family from Eminia at all. It wouldn't be too bad if there were only 1 or 2. However, there were a total of more than 10 forces. Upon seeing their reactions, Lin Li shook his head a little, and thought to himself, this is just some of the information on the surface. If they were to find out the real culprit who's instigating those forces, they would probably get a great shock. "Are you guys already feeling flustered by these?" Alan questioned in displeasure when he saw the way they behaved. At the same time, he also secretly felt thankful for the fact that he did not immediately tell everyone about Lin Li's conjecture. Otherwise, the Tower of Dusk would have been in a mess. "Is that not enough? That's almost all the top forces of the breezy plains. I'm not belittling our power. I believe that none of these forces will pose any threat to us, even if they join forces. However, we're now facing all of them, not just one or a few," Seth said in a tone that was full of anxiety. He had also gained the approval of several other senior executives. "President, the Tower of Dusk is developing too quickly, and it's inevitably going to arouse the jealousy of other forces and cause them to covet what we have. I think it is time to slow down. Those forces are undoubtedly just after benefits. As long as we give them some benefits, they probably won't really fall out with us," Pereira suggested, putting forward a conservative idea. Although it sounded a little unambitious, it was also a form of self-protection in a way. Of course, as soon as Pereira voiced his idea, Gavin, Beckley, and Alan immediately glowered at him, before Lin Li could even say anything. If it weren't for the fact that Lin Li was present, they would have probably gone forth to beat the timid Pereira up. Seth originally agreed with Pereira's idea, but when he noticed their peculiar expressions, he frantically changed his mind and said, "President, I doubt those forces have a tight alliance. We can definitely give them some interests and talk some of the forces around to break them up. By then, our crisis will naturally be resolved." Seth's suggestion would also harm the interests of the Tower of Dusk, but it was obviously more acceptable. Even Gavin and Beckley nodded slightly. Alan sneered and said, "Unfortunately, they're not just after those interests, and their alliance is not going to be divided easily." Mage Alan, what do you mean by that? Do you know something? After Seth voiced his idea, everyone got interested, and Seth even felt a little smug and complacent. Hence, when he heard what Alan said, he found it hard to accept. Alan first took a glance at Lin Li, and then turned to look at everyone after seeing Lin Li nod. These forces have colluded, and that's indeed a good way to accumulate some strength. However, it's not that easy to make all of them stand on the same line, unless there's someone manipulating them from above. Someone manipulating them, you mean? There's someone behind them who instigated them to collude together. It can't be. They're already the top forces in the breezy plains. How can they be manipulated by others? Asked Seth, who did not quite believe Alan's words. Those forces were already the top forces of the breezy plains. Usually, even the royals would not be taken seriously by them. How could they allow other forces to control them? On the other hand, Gavin had followed Master Basil for a long time, and had also spent a lot of time learning in the Dulin library. Hence, he had read through many books and materials beyond the field of magic. At this moment, he could not help but say with shock written all over his face, "You mean they've also participated?" However, in an instant, Gavin's eyes glistened, and he bitterly added, "Yeah, who else in the breezy plains apart from them can be powerful enough to do that?" Mage Gavin, Mage Alan, just what, they, do you mean? Asked Seth, even more puzzled after seeing Gavin's expression. The other senior executives such as Beckley also seemed to be rather curious. Seeing that Lin Li did not stop them, Gavin turned to say to Seth and the rest, "You guys are probably no strangers to the Glitter Gold Trade Union. How do you think these 10-odd forces compared to the Glitter Gold Trade Union? They're probably far behind the Glitter Gold Trade Union. The Glitter Gold Trade Union is an actual trade union that covers the entire Enril. Do you think the Glitter Gold Trade Union is the culprit? But don't they have a cooperative relationship with us?" Seth asked in disbelief. "No, what I'm trying to say is, which forces do you think can compare with the Glitter Gold Trade Union?" Gavin said, his voice turning a little low as he exposed his concerns. Gavin's words were like a bolt from the blue for Seth and the rest, who were so shocked that they almost got up from their chairs. In the hearts of most people, the Glitter Gold Trade Union should be second only to the Supreme Council and the two major shrines, the Brilliant Shrine and the Darkness Shrine. It could be considered the fourth greatest force in Anril. Although the Glitter Gold Trade Union might still be worlds apart from the three forces, it would be unbelievable for there to be another force that was on par with the Glitter Gold Trade Union. Actually, it's no wonder that you guys don't know. Although we have a relatively high status in the breezy plains, we've only been established for a very short time. After all, if I hadn't read some information about them, I probably wouldn't have known about their existence. Speaking of the real top force in the breezy plains, we must mention the Ashen Warlock, Roland, who lives in Grand Town, in the northern part of the breezy plains. Gavin was on the topic about forces that were comparable to the Glitter Gold Trade Union, and yet the first item he mentioned was a person. However, when Seth and the rest heard his name, no one raised any objections. It might sound absurd to include a person in the ranks of the top forces, but no one in Anril would find that statement an exaggeration. As natives of the breezy plains, how could they have not heard of Roland, the Ashen Warlock? How could they not know the stories about him? Roland, the Ashen Warlock, had always lived in the small Grand Town, in the northern part of the breezy plains, like an ordinary old man from the countryside, who often lived a quiet and regular rural life. In the small Grand Town, where there were only a few hundred households, a sneeze could be heard clearly from the other end of the town. However, no one there knew that the protagonist of the terrifying stories used to stop children from crying. Roland, the Ashen Warlock, and one of the most infamous butchers in the Felon Kingdom after the High Lord Osric was their neighbor. In the eyes of the villagers in the small Grand Town, the Ashen Warlock was just a wealthy but lonely old man. He disliked being in contact with people or talking to them. He would spend his time hiding in his house and doing some strange things, or sit around in the field and space out all day. Although he only had 2 or 3 servants by his side, they were older than him and seemed to be on the brink of death. However, many of those who thought that the servants were going to die anytime soon had all died, Yet the old servants would still show up at the door every day and bask in the sun sluggishly. However, those who practiced martial arts or magic outside of Grand Town would be warned by their teachers from the beginning not to set foot in Grand Town even if they were going to explore the Pika mountain range to fight the monsters. If they were to die in the Pika mountain range, they would die alone. However, if they angered the Ashen Warlock of Grand Town, their entire family would be affected. Those who heard the warnings would definitely not think that it was just a false warning, because the last time the Ashen Warlock was infuriated was merely 50-odd years ago. Compared to the myths and legends that happened thousands of years ago, it was a relatively short period of time, and it was as if it happened right in front of them. The reason that the Ashen Warlock flew into a rage was only because a dog he raised was trampled to death by the felon soldiers stationed at the border. Avenging his dog, he smashed half of the barracks with hellfire. However, the matter did not end there. At that time, the commander of the border was a prince of the Felon Kingdom, and the forces of the Breezy Plains, which had always been exclusive to foreigners, did not inform the prince of how horrifying that old man was. Perhaps they felt that he wouldn't believe it even if they told him about it. Hence, after being shamed, the prince immediately ordered for tens of thousands of soldiers to break into Grand Town and arrest all the villagers of that town, after which he threatened them to hand over the murderer. However, that prince ended up facing the scene of the Ashen Warlock, opening the door of the abyss and summoning a high-level demon that took thousands of lives overnight. Afterwards, the royals of the Felon Kingdom deployed their most elite Sky Knights and wanted to kill the Ashen Warlock and the demon he summoned at all costs. At the same time, the Adventurers Guild also offered a reward of up to 5 million gold coins to anyone who would kill the Ashen Warlock. It was an unprecedentedly high bounty, which immediately attracted countless adventurers. However, in the end, the Sky Knights, who had 500 griffins, ended up fleeing back to Alana with only less than 100 survivors left. The adventurers who took on the mission were identified in the files of the Adventurers Guild, and there was the word "deceased" annotated neatly beside their names. This was the price to pay if one were to offend the Ashen Warlock. No one would know whether the ant they stepped on in Grand Town might actually belong to the Ashen Warlock. If it did, they had to be an unlucky man. Hence, everyone was warned against visiting that rural settlement. That town that seemed peaceful was in fact the scariest part of the Breezy Plains. But, Mage Gavin, we know that the Ashen Warlock has a frightening ability. If he had really wanted to find trouble with us, he would have confronted us long ago. This was the reason for Seth and the others not to associate the matter with Ashen Warlock. The Tower of Dusk was strong, but it was not formidable to the extent that the Ashen Warlock had to play tricks on them. That's right, that is what I wanted to say. Apart from the Glitter Gold Trade Union and Ashen Warlock, there are 3 other powerful forces in the Breezy Plains that are not known to many. These 3 forces are the real deal in the Breezy Plains. They are the Blood Moon Clan, Mithril Alliance, and Caesar family, replied Gavin slowly. He spoke of the 3 names that were unfamiliar to Seth and the others. Caesar family. Lin Li repeated one of the names. Caesar family was not what he predicted to be one of their enemies this time. Yes, Mr. President, I do not know much about the Blood Moon Clan, but I know that they were the force that rose very quickly in the Breezy Plains after the Dark Age. The Mithril Alliance and the Caesar family, on the other hand, had been long-standing forces in the Breezy Plains since the Dark Age. These 2 forces are related as well. It was said that the Caesar family was the founder of the Mithril Alliance, yet they left the Mithril Alliance for some reason. I am unable to provide you with more details on these 3 forces due to the lack of information on my side, but I can confirm that each of these 3 forces will be a match for the Glitter Gold Trade Union. They might even be more powerful than Glitter Gold Trade Union, said Gavin guilty. While Gavin was not able to provide more information, what he said was shocking enough. If the list of names they had acquired previously was a huge problem to the Tower of Dusk, it would not matter now, as there would always be solutions to problems. But, if what Gavin said was true, the Tower of Dusk would not be facing any problem, but an impending disaster. The men were not feeling worried anymore. What they felt instead was deep helplessness and fear. Mr. President, this is still Mage Gavin's hypothesis, and we don't have any concrete evidence that this matter would involve any stronger force, said Seth as he looked at Lin Li expectantly, waiting for Mr. President to deny the information Gavin had brought up. It would be impossible for the hundreds of forces to have such a unified action if it was a temporary alliance. Furthermore, if you take a look at what they have been doing recently, you will know that this is not any simple fight over their own interests. This is a stranglehold. The rapid progress of the Tower of Dusk has threatened them. There are enough people with authority in the Breezy Plains. They would not hope to increase that number, said Lin Li calmly as he shook his head. If it was any simple issue that involved mere benefits, a partnership would be able to work. Although it was not as time efficient as robbery, the long-term benefits were. What would truly help these forces progress further? If they wanted to compete for monetary profit, it would be faster if they were to steal the potion formulas and forging blueprints from the Tower of Dusk and sell them at the original market rate. Even if they wanted to capture the market with a lower price, they would not need to reduce their prices to the extent that they would not earn any profit. But it seemed that their motive was definitely not such profits, but to cut off the financial source of the Tower of Dusk, and thus their ability to operate. Yes, the motive of our enemies is not to gain from us, but to push us back to our starting point, or eliminate us from the breezy plains. I presume that the rest of you have been encountering other challenges, as well, not just the stagnation of sales. Is the supply of raw materials affected as well? Gavin inquired as he swept his gaze across everyone's faces. It made several higher-ups speechless. The rapid progress made by the Tower of Dusk these 2 years was definitely terrifying. Their operations against the other forces in Duland were even more fear-inducing. It made them one of the real deals in the breezy plains. They took over all the quality resources in Duland as well as in certain regions around it. They enjoyed a never-ending stream of rare herbs, quality ores, and magic resources, which they transformed into massive wealth to fuel their growth. Apart from ores and herbs, an important and meaningful resource in any force would be talents. Talented individuals made up the foundation of any powerful force. They were the ones pertinent to the survival and progress of these forces. Any force with sufficient talents would have the authority to snatch any resources they lacked. If a force only had a group of Mrns instead, any amount of wealth would be futile as they wouldn't be able to defend against their own stupidity. Strictly speaking, the Tower of Dusk should be called the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic. In theory, it had the right to receive all mages in the breezy plains. However, even Emerald Tower, which was situated in the remote and tiny Jarosis, did not allow every mage to join the guild. How would it be different for the numerous organizations in the breezy plains? Each of these forces occupied a piece of territory in the breezy plains. They would try to attract the talents from one another's territory with attractive rewards. While smaller forces were unable to provide rewards that were too attractive, they could still take advantage of their geographical territory to recruit some of these talents. If not for Basil, who recommended a batch of mages to the Tower of Dusk when they had been established, it would definitely have been a challenge for the tower to hire real talents. Without quality manpower, Lin Li wouldn't have the ability to develop the Tower of Dusk so rapidly with all of his might. Now, the Tower of Dusk had gained extreme fame in the breezy plains, and it had power over Duland and the surrounding regions. But their ability to gather talents was mostly limited to these boundaries. That was because these talents were not only magic talents or high-level warriors. They included esteemed individuals in various fields, such as blacksmiths and pharmacists, and even common men who were proficient in other matters. That was the reason behind the Tower of Dusk's speedy growth and expansion. The people here all had managerial positions in the Tower of Dusk, and were clearly aware of their predicament. They were only in denial. Mr. President, I suggest to keep this information between the few of us. If this were to be leaked to other mages, I fear. That was Pereira, who was wiping the sweat off his forehead anxiously. It seemed like they had to become enemies with the whole breezy plains. If such news was to be known by the mages under them, there might only be a handful of them still willing to serve at the Tower of Dusk. If that situation were to come, the Tower of Dusk would disintegrate before it faced its enemies. This concern was not an unreasonable one. After all, they previously had a traitor. Loyalty was not something that could be depended on. Hence, the suggestion made by Pereira was well received by all of the higher-ups, including Gavin and Alan. However, Lin Li laughed it off casually. We don't have to hide this information from them at all. The door of the Tower of Dusk has always been open. We respect Evrion's decision on that. Also, don't you think this is a great chance for us to eliminate those who do not have a sense of belonging and loyalty to the tower? Said Lin Li, calmly as he swept his gaze across everyone. Lin Li's casual tone was like a gust of chilly wind to the ears of Seth, Pereira, and the other new higher-ups. They felt as though their souls were going to freeze. Their expressions turned awkward, and they started to sweat. Frankly speaking, it would be a lie to say that these higher-ups were not thinking otherwise when they heard about their potential enemies. While they worried about losing the other mages, they were thinking of a way out of the situation for themselves as well. But Lin Li's words were like a bucket of cold water in the winter that flushed those thoughts away. They felt that the open-door policy and respect for every member were lies. Even if Lin Li was being honest about them, he had to be referring to the normal mages. As the higher-ups of the Tower of Dusk, all of them were aware of certain organization secrets. They were incredibly scared that if they were to be suspected of wanting to leave the tower, they would vanish from this world the next moment. But If one were to look at the matter from another perspective, if the higher-ups were already fearful for their lives, how would normal mages feel about the matter? It seemed like the concerns advanced by the higher-ups were valid as well. After all, there was a real difference in abilities. Unlike the newly promoted higher-ups, Gavin and Alan, the senior leaders of the tower, were naturally not intending to run from the challenge, but they were also worried that such news would stir up unrest within the tower. Lin Li waved his arms upon seeing Gavin's and Alan's attempt to speak up. Alright, let's end the discussion here. As for the challenges faced by each department recently, please return to your department and think of a temporary solution. The time is tight. In fact, although their opponents had brought about trouble for the Tower of Dusk, it was definitely not sufficient to destroy the entire tower. The Tower of Dusk was not entirely reliant on the breezy plains. It outsourced herbs from the Emerald Forest of the Elven Kingdom, and ores from Leaden Kingdom's quality mines. These resources and partnerships were not what the traditional forces in the breezy plains could control. Frankly speaking, even if the Tower of Dusk couldn't afford to overcome these problems, the other forces might not even have the resources to continue their plans to destroy the tower. If they really wanted to do that, they would have to use physical force. Hence, the current treatment was just an appetizer, and not something that could last. Hey, do you know why we seem to be faced with so many obstacles recently? I heard that we are faced with a huge problem, said one mage to the others during their leisure time. They were discussing the issues that had been happening in the Tower of Dusk. Of course, I even went to look through some history books about the breezy plains. To be honest, if not for the recent happenings, I wouldn't have believed that there are such terrifying forces in the breezy plains, replied a middle-aged mage as he sighed and shook his head worriedly. The trouble the Tower of Dusk was met with was no secret among the mages. Lin Li's silent consent allowed information of the three forces to be spread among the mages very quickly. Although they were only given 3 names, they would be able to find certain information about them if they put in enough effort in their research. The mages knew very quickly that their opponent this time was mightier than the Dark Blade, and was even comparable to the Glitter Gold Trade Union. Yet, while some of the mages were really concerned about the future of the tower, what the higher-ups were worried about did not happen. As the mages discussed the possible repercussions of the actions by their opponents, their topic of discussion even diverted without them noticing it. How would they matter? They exist because the Tower of Dusk wasn't there to defeat them in the past. If they had been really powerful, why hadn't they stepped up when the Retribution Knight was here to wreak havoc? It was Mr. President who got rid of that Retribution Knight that was known as the Demon Deity, said a young mage who had participated in the Underground Palace mission. But what if they were only trying to preserve their energy at that point in time? After all they had to care about was personal interests. I bet they were in joy when they saw Rodhart help them eliminate so many other forces and leave behind so much barren land, retorted that middle-aged mage immediately. If the breezy plains really became a piece of barren land, what benefits would they gain out of it? Furthermore, even if they were really preserving their energy, I don't believe that they would have the ability to overpower the Tower of Dusk. We have Mr. President with us. You wouldn't be able to imagine how powerful he is if you didn't participate in that mission, responded the young mage. He raised the corners of his lips proudly, and in his eyes was a sense of indifference towards the lurking forces. It seemed that he was extremely confident about the future of the Tower of Dusk. The young mage's attitude did not anger the middle-aged mage. He was instead curious about what the young mage was thinking. You have such great confidence. I only know that Mr. President used a single spell to defeat 2 legendary powerhouses from the Dark Blade. Are you saying that Mr. President was capable of more? He asked him. TSK, how could the 2 legendary powerhouses from Dark Blade be comparable to that Retribution Knight? Not to mention Mr. President having the ability to defeat a Retribution Knight single-handedly. I bet you wouldn't be able to imagine what spells he used. If you want to know why I have so much confidence in him, let me tell you my reasons. As Lin Li did not forbid the mages on that mission to divulge anything about the mission, there was nothing for this young mage to fear. He started to talk about everything he had witnessed to the other mages around him. I bet you know about the 2 undead servants, Lichufalusi and Vampire Norfaler, working under Mr. President. Both of them are in the legendary level, and are definitely esteemed powerhouses. Mr. President also had a magical item in his hands that could help him summon the legendary level Lord of Nightmares and a real adult red dragon in the legendary realm. Not only that, there is also Master Conorus, who had the ability to defeat 20 Death Knights single-handedly. He is definitely second only to Mr. President in terms of powers. Also, I bet none of you would believe that Mr. President actually has a team of 40 paladins. I had seen its ability. It is definitely enough for the team to deal with 3 to 4 leaders of the Dark Blade, who are in the legendary realm. On top of that, he has a magical beast as well. Although I'm not sure what it is, I am amazed that it has the ability to cast an unlimited number of legendary level spells instantaneously despite being a petite beast. The magic storm that is created from the combination of different legendary level spells is definitely not something any common legendary mage can spawn. You can count to see how many legendary powerhouses our president would be able to deal with just by his own forces alone. To me, he would be able to defeat 15 to 16 real legendary powerhouses at the minimum. Think about that. Who else apart from the Supreme Council, Brilliant Shrine, and Darkness Shrine would have the ability to do that? If the three forces were the real powerhouses in the breezy plains, I bet they wouldn't have to hide behind the covers at all. The mages who had not participated in the underground palace mission were stunned as they listened to what their peer had said. They knew that Mr. President was a really powerful man, and knew that his two undead servants were in the legendary realm, but never would they have thought that those weren't everything. Their president actually had the power to deal with 15 to 16 legendary powerhouses. The thought of that was simply astonishing. They wouldn't have trusted the news if it hadn't been from a fellow mage. Legendary powerhouses were considered godlike existences to normal men. One legendary mage would be enough to take down a very powerful force. For example, Master Cheyenne alone was enough to uphold the powerful Manhwa family's reputation in Aminia City as the top family of the breezy plains. If they were to look at the Dark Blade, they would remember that the organization led by three legendary powerhouses was the top bandit organization of the breezy plains. It was even known as the strongest force in the breezy plains in the past. But now, although the Tower of Dusk was a relatively new organization, and none of the mages except Alan had reached the legendary realm, the power their president held alone was sufficient to defeat 15 to 16 legendary powerhouses. What was there for the Tower of Dusk to fear if they already had such an advantage? I don't think it is possible, gasped several mages. With their lack of experience, they really could not imagine what force would have such a formidable power. How is it impossible? We, the Tower of Dusk, have been partnering the Brilliant Shrine and Darkness Shrine so closely, and have been having a good relationship with the Elven, Felon, and Leaden Kingdom. Even if our opponent has the ability to control the other forces in the breezy plains, do you think these forces would want to harm us? Do not forget that it was Archbishop Martin who invited Mr. President to their Brilliant Shrine the other time. That can only show how much respect Archbishop Martin had for Mr. President. Do you think our allies would turn a blind eye when the Tower of Dusk is faced with troubles? It was true that there had been a pessimistic and anxious sentiment among the mages of the Tower of Dusk when they heard about their opponents. It would be a lie to say that there weren't timid mages who intended to leave the tower, but the members who had participated in the underground palace mission with Lin Li were able to transform the negativity with stories of Lin Li's performances and the advantages the tower had that day. Of course, there were still mages who felt that it would be illogical to assume that their predicament was as simple as that mission. These mages were unable to believe what they heard and were still concerned about the future of the tower. But there were extremely few mages who left due to their lack of courage. The others chose to stay to observe the situation further. After all, choosing to leave the tower at such a timing would be detrimental to their reputation. No other forces would want to recruit scaredy cats who would escape crises. This situation assured the higher-ups to direct all their attention to the managing of their operations against the other forces. It was just like what Lin Li had said. It wouldn't be possible for anyone to critically attack the tower financially. Although the Tower of Dusk was established in Duland, and only had influence over Duland and a few surrounding regions, their business network had long stretched outside the breezy plains. That opponent hidden behind the scenes might be able to prevent the Tower of Dusk from selling any potion or any weapon, and from acquiring any piece of herb or ore in the breezy plains, but wouldn't have the ability to do anything outside the breezy plains. They wouldn't be able to control the royal office of Felon and Leaden, or influence the two great shrines in any way. If they had that ability, they wouldn't have to fear the rise of the Tower of Dusk. Of course, as Anral was a world that lacked space-related magical items, they needed traders to mobilize material resources. Hence, if they were to block the flow of goods with armed troops, they would be able to create real trouble for certain forces. Shortly after Lin Li returned from the underground palace, 3 of the 10 strongest bandit organizations attacked the tower's caravans successively. It was very obvious that the mastermind behind the scenes was attempting to cut off the connection the Tower of Dusk had with the outside world, and trap the tower in Duland. Perhaps knowing how scary it was to offend the Tower of Dusk, the 3 bandit organizations actually put aside the filthy tricks they had in their sleeves to form an alliance with one another to plan a strategy to prepare for a possible revenge made by the tower. While these 3 bandit organizations were originally ranked in the middle, their combined power would bring them to the first place on that list. It would be no exaggeration to say that they would be able to match up to the former Dark Blade. Based on the understanding the outside world had of the Tower of Dusk. The real deal was that young president and his two undead servants in the legendary realm. Although the combined forces of the three bandit organizations were not sufficient to challenge the Tower of Dusk head-on, they thought that they would still be able to intimidate the tower if they were to go against it at such a timing. At once, all of the forces focused all their attention on the Tower of Dusk. They were all curious how the Tower of Dusk would approach the matter. Everyone thought that this would be a complex problem for the young president. If he did not respond, that might be a huge blow to the Tower of Dusk. If the Tower of Dusk wanted to take revenge on the three bandit organizations, it would only make sense for that young president and the other two undead servants to participate in the battle, but this would benefit the other factions. Yet, none of the forces had expected that the young president from the Tower of Dusk would not step in to handle the matter himself. He did not send his two undead servants in the legendary realm to deal with it either. It was a team of 40 paladins that came out of the Tower of Dusk. Each of the paladins was donned in a set of silver armor and was riding on a pure white unicorn. What stunned them even more was how they exuded the same kind of tremendous and pure divine power as the holy paladins from the Brilliant Shrine, who were responsible for guarding the Holy Mountain. The partnership between the Tower of Dusk and the Brilliant Shrine was known to everyone in the Breezy Plains. But, if the Brilliant Shrine would send their holy paladins to the Tower of Dusk, the nature of their alliance was definitely not as simple as what they thought it to be. Even if there were other authorities overseeing the operations in the Breezy Plains, how would they not reconsider their perception of the Tower of Dusk? Everyone knew that the holy paladins were in charge of guarding the Holy Mountain that belonged to the Brilliant Shrine. They were the personal pontifical guards of Pope Rosario. The holy paladins would never leave the Holy Mountain unless the Pope had to travel. Even when Prophet Willan had to purge the Retribution Knight Rodhart, there wasn't any holy paladin deployed to assist him. But they could not help but wonder about the relationship between that young president of the newly risen Tower of Dusk and Pope Rosario of the Brilliant Shrine. These forces would have to consider this question really carefully before making their next move. Although they had been taking the orders from the mastermind to target the Tower of Dusk with all sorts of tactics, they should be weighing whether their life wouldn't be more important than the rewards they gained with their deeds. They would definitely not have imagined that these holy paladins were in fact Death Knights, who had the ability to control divine power, and those white unicorns were merely transformed nightmare beasts. Not to mention their inability to imagine such an absurd idea. They would not believe it to be true even if they were told about it. To say that undead creatures would have the power to control divine power would be more ridiculous than to say that the young mage of the Tower of Dusk was the illegitimate son of the Pope of the Brilliant Shrine. Although the team of three bandit organizations had thought that the Tower of Dusk would not be seeking revenge anytime soon, they could not help but gather their forces in the Dragon Mountains to await their retaliation in case of any miscalculation. But they did not expect to meet the holy paladins from the Brilliant Shrine, and not the young president from Tower of Dusk. Although some of the stolen goods were what the Tower of Dusk had purchased from the Brilliant Shrine, they did not believe that that would offend the holy paladins. Offending the Tower of Dusk and offending the Brilliant Shrine were two separate matters. The Brilliant Shrine was known to be one of the strongest forces in the whole of Anril, and was not an organization which anyone would dare to confront. The three legendary level leaders from the bandit organizations were still hoping that it was just a misunderstanding as they brought their men out of their hideouts in trepidation. They stuttered as they tried their best to clarify the misunderstanding before the 40 armored paladin, who exuded divine power from head to toe. Yet, these paladin-like men had no interest in hearing the three leaders explain themselves. The Retribution Knight in the team raised his holy cross spear and led the nightmare beasts towards the team of bandits without any warning. The Death Knights behind him exuded great holy aura as they got into an arrow formation and charged towards the bandits. The other forces sent their spies to assess the situation right after the holy paladins left the scene of the massacre. A once hustling city had become dead quiet. Bodies were everywhere, and on each of their faces was a peculiar smile that caused the spies to shudder in trepidation. Their prior experience of witnessing large-scale battles did not help to allay their fear at all. It only took the holy paladins half a day to purge the three legendary level leaders and their 1,000 bandit elites with the holy light. This outcome was a validation of the identity of the paladins. Except for the holy paladins from Brilliant Shrine, no one in the whole of Anril would have such a formidable ability. The goods that had been robbed by the three organizations were all left untouched in their warehouse. Although they were not collected by the holy paladins, none of the forces dared to lay their hands on that huge wealth. To them, these goods were no wealth, but the scariest curse in this world. The bodies lying outside were the proof of this theory. The appearance of the holy paladins made the forces cease all of their suppression of the Tower of Dusk. Although none of them understood the relationship between the Tower of Dusk and the Brilliant Shrine, The fact that the personal imperial guards of the Pope of Brilliant Shrine appeared at such a place explained the gist of the situation. Now, none of the forces would dare to provoke the Tower of Dusk before they received any new instruction from the hidden mastermind. In the beginning, this incident had created a lot of worry among the people in the Tower of Dusk. They knew that it would be extremely dangerous if the forces were successful in their efforts to block their operations. Yet, this worry did not last. The 40 holy paladins only took half a day to resolve the matter. That was like a glimpse of light in the dark tunnel for the originally pessimistic mages. They became extremely confident about the future of the Tower of Dusk. What difficulties can't be solved with Mr. President's massive powers and the support he has from the Brilliant Shrine? While these mages were still unclear about the reason behind the appearance of the holy paladins at their tower, that did not matter to them anymore. Their appearance was sufficient to prove the extreme support the Tower of Dusk had from the Brilliant Shrine. "Mr. President, we have an invitation letter," said a young mage, as he went up to Lin Li, quickly upon seeing him come out of the laboratory. He had been waiting outside. Lin Li had just finished a meeting with the pharmacists. He was explaining some new potion formula to replace those that had been stolen. He was confident that the potion would be ready for mass production very soon. It was the same in the forging workshop. The workshop had already started producing new magical equipment, and Lin Li was certain that their new products would be a deal breaker against the opponent's corporate raid. Lin Li did not expect the invitation letter. He knew that people he had closer ties with, such as the Brilliant Shrine and Darkness Shrine, would not send him a mere letter if they had to look for him. Could it be the next tactic of that mastermind? Lin Li received the letter and discovered that it was without an envelope. It was a very normal piece of letter paper with creases on it. Yet, a very unique magical wave radiated from the folded letter. Lin Li was taken aback before he could read the words written on it clearly. Despite being a common piece of letter paper, the ink on it was a precious type of magical ink, used to inscribe master-level magaths. As a guru of inscription, Lin Li was familiar with the formulas of all types of magical ink. Because of that, he could not help but feel that the letter was a ridiculous one. Not to mention that the sender had used a precious magical ink. What was absurd was that the ink was written on a piece of extremely ordinary letter paper. He just could not imagine who would squander on such a trivial matter. There were not a lot of words in the invitation letter. There were only a date and an address. The date was 5 days from today, and the contents of the letter were extremely simple. It did not mention any provinces or regions, but just a name of a location, Grand Town. The letter ended with the signature of the sender, Ashen Warlock. Seeing that the inviter was the Ashen Warlock, Lin Li couldn't help but frown a little and ask the mage who brought him the letter, "Where is the person who sent the letter?" He could tell from the magical ink on the letter that the letter was definitely real. However, the content of the letter was too simple because only the time and sender's signature were stated. Upon hearing Lin Li's question about the person who delivered the letter, the mage painstakingly tried to force a smile, and said with slight difficulty, "Mr. President, I initially wanted to invite the messenger in to wait for a while, but the old man who delivered the letter said that he still had to go home to take care of his field, and so he didn't want to waste any more time here. By the way, he also asked for 10 gold coins as a reward for delivering the letter." "Oh, did you give it to him?" Lin Li asked, finding it a little amusing. The Ashen Warlock was living in seclusion in Grand Town, and that was something that everyone in the Breezy Plains knew about. However, Lin Li didn't expect the Ashen Warlock to let an ordinary farmer deliver the letter. "Yes, I initially wanted to give him more, but he refused to accept the money. He said that he only wanted to get paid for how much work he had done, and that it was just delivering a letter, so he merely wanted some money for travel expenses." It was not that the young mage was dumb. He could also detect the magical waves emanating from the crumpled letter, and could naturally tell that the origin of the letter was not simple. "Okay, you are dismissed," said Lin Li as he put away the letter and waved to let the mage leave. Although there was no substantial information about the Ashen Warlock's invitation on the letter, Lin Li could more or less guess what it was about. It could also be considered to be a tradition of the Breezy Plains. Every 3 years, the Ashen Warlock would send an invitation letter to the leaders of the most powerful forces of the Breezy Plains to invite them to Grand Town. Although the invitation letter was so simple that it looked like a joke, it was like an edict from the deities in the Breezy Plains. No one would dare to show the slightest contempt. At the same time, in the eyes of most people, the seemingly ordinary invitation letter was also a status symbol, which signified that one was standing on the pinnacle of the breezy plains with their respective forces. That was not an exaggeration at all. Ever since the Dark Age, the Ashen Warlock had been living in seclusion in the small grand town. He had also left behind numerous stories about his horrifying deeds, as well as some rumors and legends. The incident that took place more than 50 years ago was just one of the insignificant ones. Hundreds of years ago, the Retribution Knight Rodhart led the Death Knights to conduct a massacre in the breezy plains, and brought about a huge disaster. Under the attacks of the Death Knights, strong cities were turned into ruins, and various legendary powerhouses with great reputation had all fallen under Rodhart's eternal frostblade. At that time, Rodhart split his nearly 1,000 Death Knights into two in order to speed up the harvesting of their souls. However, Rodhart did not expect that to be the worst decision of his life apart from choosing to become the Retribution Knight. The 500-odd Death Knights in the north still possessed the strength to besiege more than a dozen legendary powerhouses even though they were not led by Rodhart himself. They were much stronger than the Griffin Riders of the Felon Kingdom. However, even a team with such power actually went missing on their way to Grand Town. At that time, the residents of the town didn't even know that they had had a close shave with death. However, when Rodhart detected that they were missing and arrived outside Grand Town, he only stayed for a while before fleeing back to the southern part of the breezy plains. Up until he was purified by the prophet Willen, Rodhart did not reveal the slightest intention of going north, which was also the reason he had a tinge of vitality left during the disaster in the breezy plains. Unfortunately, the Ashen Warlock did not intend to be the guardian of the breezy plains, and he simply didn't want anyone to disturb his peaceful life. Otherwise, the prophet Willen wouldn't have had the chance to purify Rodhart. Another event that spread like wildfire in the breezy plains, which was also recorded in history, was the disbanding of the Rebellion Alliance, which resulted from a conflict of interests during the most chaotic period in Anril. The orcs, who had long been coveting the fertile soil of the breezy plains, had once organized an army to encroach on the breezy plains. The orcs did not have any strict military discipline. Besides, at that time, they believed that they had suffered a loss in the distribution of interests amongst the Rebellion Alliance, and thus wouldn't be kind to the civilians. In fact, they had done all evil such as murder and arson. They would leave behind ruins wherever they went, and their cruelty and ruthlessness were no less than those of the Death Knights. However, when the orcs arrived in Grand Town, the Ashen Warlock appeared in front of them, clad in a black robe. He simply told them to scram in a low and stern voice, after which the countless orcs around him suddenly retreated entirely like a tide, leaving behind only some banners, weapons, and countless corpses that were trampled to death. That was also the incident that made the people of the breezy plains know that such a powerful and daunting man actually lived in seclusion in the unassuming town, in the northern part of the breezy plains. No one knew how old the Ashen Warlock was, or how long he had lived in Grand Town for. All they knew was that he had been living in a dilapidated tower in Grand Town. To their astonishment, even during the Dark Age, Grand Town was still like a paradise that was completely unaffected by the chaos going on in the breezy plains. Even the extremely powerful High Elves seemed to have strictly abided by a certain agreement, and had never set foot in Grand Town during the Dark Age. During the Dark Age, it was the High Lord Osric who dominated and ruled the breezy plains and the Felon Kingdom. Even the terrifying Endless Abyss was conquered by the Magic Legion led by Osric. The ancient demon deity Balak, known as the most powerful in terms of combat power, was actually doomed in the hands of Osric. Yet, Grand Town remained a forbidden area in the breezy plains. Many people believed that the Ashen Warlock might have met Osric and made an unknown agreement with him. However, Lin Li heard another incredible statement from Angelano. Angelano was Osric's first follower, and was once known as one of Osric's 3 butchers. Hence, he naturally knew more about Osric than the others. No one knows what the Ashen Warlock did, but he simply waved his hands, and thousands of elite fighters of the Magic Legion lost their lives instantly. They aged very quickly, decomposed, and turned into ashes. I could sense a strange force even when I was observing through the crystal ball. Angelano began to recall the old memories, and couldn't help but say in a shaky voice, ever since then, Osric never mentioned the Ashen Warlock again. It was as if he had completely forgotten about this matter, and focused all of his energy on the construction of the Eternal Furnace. If Lin Li had heard about the matter from others, he probably wouldn't have believed it at all. Osric was the proud disciple of the Immortal King, a powerhouse who was said to be no less powerful than the High Elven Queen in the Dark Age. The High Elves' Magic Legion was extremely powerful, and they had once swept through the Endless Abyss, causing countless powerful abyssal demons to flee for their lives. However, the Ashen Warlock actually turned thousands of soldiers of the Magic Legion into ashes with the wave of his hands, making it impossible for the arrogant High Lord Osric to even think of taking revenge. Lin Li couldn't imagine what level of strength the Ashen Warlock had reached, but he reckoned that it probably wasn't worse than that of the 3 arbitrators of the Supreme Council. It was precisely the tyrannical and domineering power of the Ashen Warlock Roland that allowed him to be above all forces of the breezy plains, just like a god looking down at other sentient beings. After the Dark Age ended for more than 1,300 years, and the initial war between the nations that were competing for territory, Anril remained peaceful for nearly a millennium. However, the breezy plains was an exception. Although it belonged to the Felon Kingdom in name, the royal family had very little control over the breezy plains. Due to the fact that there had never been an actual ruler, the breezy plains was perpetually going through tumultuous times, even though the war had ended nearly 1,000 years ago. On this piece of land, the forces of various sizes were closely related, and would get into various conflicts at all times. Hence, most outsiders would call the breezy plains a land of chaos. However, there was still some order despite the chaos, and the person who maintained order was the Ashen Warlock Roland, who was above all the forces in the breezy plains. He was the only one who was fit and able enough to enforce and maintain an order that no one would dare to violate. Roland the Ashen Warlock, who lived in the small grand town, was probably the only person who knew the reason he bothered to intervene with the disputes between forces in the breezy plains. Perhaps it was because he didn't want those disputes to affect his peaceful life, or perhaps he was just bored. In short, the tradition of the Ashen Warlock sending an invitation once every 3 years began some time ago. Every 3 years, Roland, the Ashen Warlock, would send an invitation card that was written on cheap letter paper to the leaders of the strongest forces of the breezy plains, and invite them to his dilapidated tower in the small grand town. As for the contents of the gathering, the outsiders would never find out, as it would be kept confidential to everyone except for the leaders of the major forces that participated. They only knew that after every gathering, the power distribution in the breezy plains would be finalized, and the originally intense battles would soon disappear. That was the order of the breezy plains that no one had dared to break. It was the order that the Ashen Warlock had been maintaining for years in the chaotic land, the breezy plains. It was said that there was once a level 24 leader of a top force, whose power was not inferior to the established authorities like the Blood Moon clan and the Mithril Alliance. During a gathering, that leader expressed some dissatisfaction with the order established by the Ashen Warlock. However, he began burning up right after he aired his grievances and displeasure. The infinite scion from the abyss burned on his body for 3 days and 3 nights until the last trace of his soul was burnt to ashes. He only stopped shrieking and wailing in agony then. However, the other leaders who attended the party did not dare to move, and instead remained seated while listening to the wails of agony for 3 days and 3 nights. Seeing that their opponent, who was full of rigor and dominance, previously suffered, no one even dared to blink. Ever since then, everyone knew that the Ashen Warlock, who was perpetually wrapped in the black robe, didn't need to negotiate or discuss with others at all. His words per southeast were like the edicts of the deities, and there was no room for doubt at all. After finding out some things about the Ashen Warlock Roland, Lin Li was somewhat relieved, and felt less worried about the invitation. Although the Ashen Warlock was terrifyingly powerful, and was above all the forces in the breezy plains, there was at least no need for Lin Li to worry about him colluding with other forces to go against the Tower of Dusk. Although there were still 5 days to go before the date stated in the letter, Lin Li decided to go to Grand Town to take a look since there was nothing else for him to do in the Tower of Dusk. This time, Lin Li didn't plan to bring too many people with him. All he brought were his 2 undead servants, and he got the others to stay in the Tower of Dusk. In fact, at this juncture, there was basically no need for him to worry about the security of the Tower of Dusk. With the appearance of the pseudo-holy paladins and the cruel battle, the other forces thought that the brilliant shrine was fully supporting the Tower of Dusk. Hence, who would dare to seek trouble and court death? Our Adlot Street ch Terzan in VLB, CM. Besides, there was already an ice and fire natural magical domain that had been integrated with the Eternal Furnace at the top of the Tower of Dusk, which would allow Linless mages to exert legendary combat power. Even if a sanctuary powerhouse were to attack the Tower of Dusk, it would still be difficult to defeat them. There was also the level 24 Conorus and Angelano, who controlled the Titan-level alchemy colossus. Although the 2 of them were not too loyal to Lin Li, they would not sit back and watch the Tower of Dusk get attacked by other forces. As for the Holy Death Knights, Lin Li discovered that the Death Knights had gained plenty of benefits after the intense and deadly battle. After all, out of the souls that were devoured, 3 were the souls of legendary powerhouses, which allowed 2 Death Knights to show signs of a breakthrough. It was no wonder that the Retribution Knight Rodheart would carry out a massacre in the breezy plains. The temptation to rapidly increase one's strength and powers was really not something that everyone could resist. After arranging everything in the Tower of Dusk, Lin Li brought Ufalusi and Norfaler, his two undead servants, with him and set off for Grand Town, which was in the northern part of the breezy plains. While reading the map and looking at the location of Grand Town, Lin Li was reminded of something else. Back in the big rift of the Eternal Darkness altar, he had once heard High Priest Rog talking about the battle between the Immortal King and the Dragon of Destruction. When Rog witnessed the battle between gods, he was still an ordinary human sentry, who was stationed in a location on the far northern border of the breezy plains. The place where the battle took place was Rottenmo. Lin Li could tell from the map that those two places were not too far away from the small Grand Town. Lin Li intended to stop by that place if everything went well during the gathering with the Ashen Warlock. Although Grand Town was rather far from the Tower of Dusk, Lin Li and his two undead servants were legendary powerhouses, hence, they did not encounter any hindrances along the way. By noon, they had already found the legendary Grand Town according to the map. Due to the fact that they did not know if the Ashen Warlock had any taboos, Lin Li didn't fly into the town directly, and simply found a place outside the town to land, after which they slowly walked towards the town. There were large patches of fields on both sides of the road, and the crops there seemed to be swaying like water waves amidst the breeze. There were dense forests in the distance, and although the trees were not all tall and straight, they gave off a special vibe under the blue sky and white clouds. At the end of the road was the small Grand Town. Although the town had been peaceful without any wars for thousands of years due to the existence of the Ashen Warlock, it was rather small, and there seemed to only be a few hundred families living there. The tallest building in the town was a tower that was made of limestone. Lin Li reckoned that it was the Tower of Ashes, where the Ashen Warlock Roland lived. Lin Li walked slowly into the town with two undead servants. Although the residents of the town had never seen them before, they would all smile at them hospitably. There would sometimes be a few children, playing and running past them merrily. They did not seem to keep their guard up against outsiders at all. Since he was invited by the Ashen Warlock, he ought to go to the Tower of Ashes to greet him even though he had arrived early. After Lin Li entered the town, he did not stop to appreciate the vibes of a rural life, and instead headed straight to the gray and desolate tower that was deep in the town. Although it was called a tower, it was only less than 20 meters tall. Due to the fact that it had a large area, it appeared to be rather wide and flat. When Lin Li approached the tower, he saw two old men, who were clad in servants' clothes lying lazily on the steps in front of the tower gate, and basking in the sun. Legend had it that since the Dark Age, the Ashen Warlock had been enjoying the company of 2 or 3 old servants, who did not practice martial arts or magic, just like ordinary people. However, they stayed with the Ashen Warlock in that small town for thousands of years. At this moment, Lin Li indeed did not detect any mana or combat energy from the 2 old servants basking on the steps. They looked no different from ordinary old people, and it wasn't obvious that they had lived for thousands of years. In fact, Lin Li had always been rather puzzled. Be it the Ashen Warlock or his servants, they had all lived for thousands of years. Since they had been living in seclusion in the mountains, why would the generations of residents of Grand Town, who had interacted with them for years, still see them as ordinary people? Of course, the matter might seem unbelievable to Lin Li, but the Ashen Warlock was a godlike powerhouse, who had probably used some special method. Lin Li shook his head and stopped pondering about the issue. Instead, he stepped forward and bowed to the 2 old servants to state that he had been invited by the Ashen Warlock. Although the 2 old servants looked like ordinary people, and were so old that they seemed to be on the brink of death, Lin Li didn't belittle them at all. Even if he ignored the fact that their master was the Ashen Warlock, he felt that they still deserved his respect because of their age. Upon hearing what Lin Li said, an old servant touched his belly that had turned red because of the sun without even bothering to open his eyes, and incoherently muttered, "It's not time yet. Go find a place to stay at. We don't provide food and accommodation here." Lin Li was suddenly speechless, but he had no choice but to say goodbye and return to the town with his 2 undead servants. Although the town was not located along a major road, Lin Li unexpectedly discovered that there was still a small inn in the town. However, he thought about it and felt that it did make some sense. Although there were usually not many people in Grand Town, there would be leaders of the top forces visiting once every 3 years, and they often spent gold coins, and not silver coins. Whenever the inn was open for business, they would make enough to last them for 3 years. When he walked into the inn, Lin Li looked around to see that the inn was rather clean and neat even, though it looked a little shabby. There was a chubby middle-aged man lying on the counter, and snoring in front of Lin Li. Lin Li reckoned that he had to be dreaming that he was going to strike a fortune again this time because he drooled a lot. Lin Li walked to the counter and pressed the bell a few times, after which the middle-aged man sat up and spaced out for a long time, before realizing that there was a guest. "Gee, guest, are you looking for accommodation?" the chubby middle-aged man asked awkwardly while wiping away the saliva on his lips. He then noticed that there was a pool of saliva on the counter, and quickly used his sleeve to wipe it away. "Yes, please prepare 3 rooms for me," Lin Li said as he took out a handful of gold coins and placed them on the counter. "Okay, please come with me. I will definitely prepare the best room for you." The chubby middle-aged man immediately sobered up upon sight of the glittering gold coins. Without even counting the coins, he placed them in the drawer inside the counter, stood up, and then walked away. There was actually no need to expect too much for the so-called best room in such a place. Fortunately, Lin Li was not the type to be after luxury and clout. As long as the room was clean, bright, and proper, it would be enough for him. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that he had chanced upon the inn, he wouldn't mind setting up a tent outside the town. To be honest, the tent that he had placed in his ring of endless storm was much more luxurious than the room in the inn. After arriving in the room, he dismissed the chubby owner of the inn. Lin Li then recalled what the old servant said in the Tower of Ashes earlier on, and reckoned that the Ashen Warlock Roland probably would not show up until the date stated in the invitation letter. In fact, the invitation by Ashen Warlock seemed to be more of an order. It was not an invitation for a discussion, but a judgment of the disputes between them. Hence, he felt that there was no need to entertain them at all. However, there were only 4 days before the date stated on the invitation. Even if he were to go to the outpost on the northern border, he probably wouldn't have enough time to check it out in detail. Lin Li thought about it, and decided to stay put in the town, and wait for the gathering to begin. 4 days would pass quickly anyway. Actually, Grand Town was a very ordinary town in the countryside, and if it weren't for the fact that the Ashen Warlock was living there in seclusion, there would be nothing special about this town, for there was a huge bunch of similar counterparts in the breezy plains. After Lin Li asked for a room in the small inn, he decided to stay in the room and meditate alone because he was too lazy to wander and roam about. Before Lin Li even realized, it was already dusk, and the golden rays of the evening sun coated the windows in a layer of gold. The houses outside the windows were also fuming with smoke. Lin Li, who was meditating in the room, was awakened by the sudden uproar that came from downstairs. With his current strength, there naturally wouldn't be any issues from him being interrupted during the meditation. However, the loud noises were still uncomfortable for him. However, shortly after the noises filled the air, they stopped abruptly with a loud shriek, after which Norfler said from outside the door, "Master, I've already thrown the troublemaker out." Upon hearing Norfler's report, Lin Li acknowledged it and didn't ask anything. Norfler was rather sensible and could handle things appropriately. He wouldn't solve all problems by killing. Since he had just thrown the troublemaker out, it was probably not a big deal. Downstairs in the small inn, the chubby middle-aged owner had a clear palm-shaped mark on his face, and was muttering incessantly to himself while feeling heartbroken and repairing the damaged door. He looked upstairs for a while, and then gazed out of the window at the gate, seemingly thinking about whom he should call to compensate for the broken gate. There was a young blonde man dressed in luxurious clothes, standing right outside the door of the small inn, with his face and body covered in plenty of soil. There were still some blood stains in the corners of his lips. The originally handsome young man now looked a little bit disheveled. Beside him, there were 2 people who were also lying on the ground. However, they did not seem to have any strength to get up, and were just panting. Charles scanned his surroundings and saw the curious faces that were peeking through the windows facing the street, after which his handsome and tender face flushed. It was embarrassing and shameful enough for him to be thrown out of the inn like garbage. Besides, the people he perceived as lowly and despicable actually witnessed him being thrown out. That was a complete humiliation and disgrace for him. Had he not remembered that the Ashen Warlock was living there in seclusion, he would have rushed to kill them. Of course, he definitely wouldn't let the culprit who caused him to feel that humiliation off easily. Charles looked at the door of the small inn bitterly, only to see the dirty and obnoxious chubby owner, who was repairing the damaged doors and windows. He felt that it was a form of humiliation and a reminder for him to remember where he had been thrown out from. At this moment, Charles felt that everyone within his field of vision was mocking him. However, he recalled the strength of the vampire just now, and did not have the courage to enter the store again. After all, he was just a level 19 archmage, and he could of course tell that the vampire was much stronger than him, and was definitely a legendary powerhouse. "You're still playing dead. Don't you think it's shameful enough? Raising dogs would be better than raising you too. You're just useless pieces of garbage," Charles yelled while venting his anger on the 2 subordinates of his who were lying on the ground. He had no other outlet for his anger. "Master, he's a real legendary powerhouse and a vampire. We're just servants, not guards. We can play with you. But how can we defeat the legendary powerhouse?" The 2 subordinates thought to themselves aggrievedly, but they dared not show any of their emotions on the surface. Even though they were overwhelmed with pain, they had no choice but to grit their teeth and get up from the ground. Seeing that their master was about to get angry again, one of them frantically rushed forward in a bid to avoid getting into trouble. He said, "Young master, there's a famous legendary vampire in the breezy plains, who's one of the undead servants of the president of the Tower of Dusk. Do you think?" Vampires were natural assassins, and their powerful strength and agility had always made others jealous. However, it was not an easy task for a vampire to enter the legendary realm, for it required more than just his own efforts. It also required luck and good opportunities. After he reached the peak of level 19, his own efforts would hardly have any effect. In order to break through the limitations and enter another realm, he would have to obtain blood that contained a massive amount of power. Hence, in the entire history of Anril, there were probably less than 5 vampires who had stepped into the legendary realm. The most famous legendary level vampire in the history of Anril was the legendary assassin Haller, who assassinated the sword sage Ulysses of the Felon Kingdom more than 1,300 years ago. The sword sage Ulysses was one of the 3 sword sages of the Felon Kingdom at that time, and the army below him was even known as the one with the strongest combat power in the Felon Kingdom. However, no one expected him to die just 3 days after the sword sage Ulysses led his army to the breezy plains. He was silently assassinated in his military base by the legendary level vampire Haller. The royal family of the Felon Kingdom activated 3 major imperial guards to carry out a 10-year hunt in the breezy plains, all because of that matter. It would be no exaggeration to say that they had reached out to all areas. However, the assassin Haller seemed to have vanished from the world, and the matter was still unresolved in the Felon Kingdom. There was also a famous legendary level vampire, who was one of the high priests of the Darkness Shrine. It was said that he had the oldest and purest bloodline of the vampires, and was known as the ancestor of vampires, Kalostine. However, the Darkness Shrine did not have any influence or power in the breezy plains, and thus it was naturally impossible for the vampire ancestor Kalostine to appear there. Everyone in the breezy plains knew that, when it came to legendary level vampires, there was none other than Lin Li's undead servant, Norfaller. Hence, after recognizing that the one who threw him and his subordinates out of the inn was a legendary level vampire, Charles' subordinate immediately thought of the Tower of Dusk. The Tower of Dusk. Upon hearing his subordinate's words, Charles was stunned for a moment, but he instantly yelled at the inn with hatred and resentment in his vicious gaze. "So it's that small force called the Tower of Dusk. What right do they have to be here?" "Well, maybe they've also been invited by the Ashen Warlock," his servant answered ignorantly. Although Grand Town was not isolated from the world, no ordinary people were welcome except the ones whom the Ashen Warlock invited, be it warriors or mages. Of course, no one would be willing to visit Grand Town without the Ashen Warlock's invitation, for they were all afraid of accidentally provoking the fierce and menacing Ashen Warlock. "Duh, of course I know that that's the reason," Charles yelled before turning around to walk outside. While walking, he cursed in his heart, "What Tower of Dusk? Don't think they can be compared to us, just because they have received an invitation from the Ashen Warlock. How dare you intervene with my affairs? This time, I'll let you know that you are way too weak and incompetent, compared to us, the established families." "Young master, you..." Upon hearing Charles' words, the subordinates could not help but speed up and chase after him. Although the noises in the room on the first floor of the inn had already ceased, Lin Li could no longer be bothered to continue meditating. Instead, he took out a historical biography of Anril and began reading it casually. At this juncture, the sounds of people chatting could be heard coming from outside the door. It turned out to be the sounds of the chubby owner of the inn apologizing to Norfaller because of the matter that happened just now. In fact, squabbles and arguments were common in inns of other places. However, the small Grand Town was a reclusive residential area for the Ashen Warlock, who was menacing and fierce. Everyone was extremely cautious for fear that they would die if they were to be careless and commit unforgivable mistakes. Hence, Lin Li initially didn't bother to question what happened, but since the chubby owner of the inn had come upstairs, Lin Li, too, wanted to find out what was going on. Besides, Lin Li was also a little curious about how the residents of this small town felt about the Ashen Warlock. Thus, he instructed Norfaller, who was standing by the door, to allow the chubby owner to enter. "Guest, I'm so sorry to have interrupted you while you were resting for just now," said the chubby owner, who was rather respectful and polite towards Lin Li, perhaps because of the 1,000 gold coins, or because Norfaller had stepped in to give him an out. Lin Li looked at the clear palm prints on the chubby owner's face, and was somewhat surprised. He thought it was just a trivial verbal conflict, yet the chubby owner had been assaulted. Hence, Lin Li asked, "Why did that happen just now?" "They actually hit you too. That man said that I didn't use any honorifics when I greeted him, but I don't know any honorifics at all. My inn has been in business for so many years in this town, and I greet every guest in the same way. No one is as great of a troublemaker as he is, said the chubby owner. He looked aggrieved and stretched his finger to touch his face, only to realize that it still hurt badly. Lin Li was amused by the grimace on the chubby owner's face, but he knew that the latter was indeed not to be blamed for the matter. The one who got thrown out deserved it too. Lin Li thought, why won't he take a look at where we are? We're in a remote town. What's there to pretend for in such a place? He even wants others to greet him with honorifics. Does he think he's facing a butler of an aristocratic family, who had been through prestigious and professional training? He's already been driven away, so I won't talk about this. What have you found out about the owner of that gray tower? Asked Lin Li. He didn't take this matter to heart, and instead turned to ask the chubby man about the Ashen Warlock. Of course, he didn't point out the identity of the Ashen Warlock, because he didn't know if the latter had any concerns. Oh, you are asking about that old man. The chubby owner was a little confused. Don't all people come here because they were invited by the strange old man? Why are they asking me about it? He thought. However, he knew that the person who helped him just now was the young guest Lin Li's subordinate, who was clearly much stronger and competent than Charles. Hence, he didn't hesitate. However, the words of the chubby owner didn't make Lin Li feel too surprised, because what he knew about the Ashen Warlock was nothing more than his eccentric behavior and strange behavior. Nothing peculiar about the Ashen Warlock and his 2 old servants was mentioned. In the eyes of the chubby owner, the Ashen Warlock and his 2 old servants were simply ordinary old men from the countryside. He even felt a little sympathetic towards the Ashen Warlock for having no children to look after him at such an old age. Lin Li wasn't disappointed, but he lost interest in listening. Hence, he decided to dismiss the chubby owner, so that he could continue reading. However, at this moment, there were some other noises coming from outside the inn which were much louder than before. The chubby owner immediately blushed. After all, it was his inn, and he felt rather embarrassed about the fact that his guests were constantly disturbed. The chubby owner smiled at Lin Li awkwardly, and quickly strode towards the window in a bid to berate the people, who were kicking up a ruckus outside. However, when he looked outside through the window, he was so frightened that he immediately shut his mouth up, and took a few steps back, almost falling onto the ground. He turned his head and looked at Lin Li, who was seated, and his fat cheeks trembled together with his body. He said in a shaky voice, dear guest, that person is back, and he brought a lot of people with him. Actually, Lin Li didn't need the chubby owner to inform him, because he had long heard the sounds of scoldings from outside. Hence, he was well aware of who had arrived. The matter was within his expectations. How could a person who hit someone else for failing to address him with honorifics possibly tolerate the humiliation of suffering a loss? Charles, who had just left, stood proudly at the door outside the small inn, with the same 2 subordinates beside him, and a large group of uniformly dressed mages behind him. They were standing neatly in a single file, and one would be able to tell at first glance that they were all well trained. Everyone looked in front with expressionless faces while raising their staffs high up in front of their chests, getting ready to cast magic any moment. The ones from the Tower of Dusk, come out now. I know you're hiding in there. Weren't you being really arrogant just now? You actually had the guts to hit me. Why have you become a coward now? If I don't teach you a memorable lesson today, you guys will really get so complacent and think that you're too good for the breezy plains. With the mages behind him, Charles was much more courageous and brave. He was confident that his mages would be able to protect him even if the legendary level vampire were to step forth. Charles' subordinate stood up with a smug expression, and asked him, young master, are they trying to flee because they heard us? Yeah, if they run away, who am I supposed to look for to settle the scores? Charles said while looking a little dazed. He pointed his staff at the mages on both sides, and continued, you guys, surround the small inn and make sure nothing gets out, not even a single fly. Damn it, it's just a small and insignificant Tower of Dusk. Yet he has the audacity to be rude to me. I'm going to make sure he regrets being born. It was noisy outside, but it wasn't quiet inside, either. The chubby owner would have never expected for such a huge commotion to break out just because he had failed to address Charles with any honorifics. Actually, even till now, he still didn't understand why he was wrong, and what Charles was referring to by saying honorifics. However, no matter what, he was the one who'd caused the issues to arise. Seeing the menacing bunch of people downstairs, the chubby owner was so frightened that he paced in circles in the room while muttering to himself, and trying to figure out what he should do. Amused by the sight of the chubby owner breaking out in a sweat, Lin Li asked, have you never encountered such an incident before? Those who thought that they were much more noble and prestigious than others would visit Grand Town once every 3 years. Whenever they visited, they would stay in the inn for 2 days. Yet, why did someone find fault with the chubby owner for failing to address him with honorifics this time? How would I know? It's my first time seeing that person. I used to greet those old men in the same way. Who knew he'd be so troublesome? Dear guest, why don't you guys hide? After all, There are so many of them, the chubby owner said to Lin Li in a bid to persuade him to hide. However, his expression clearly implied something else. He was just worried that Lin Li would abandon him and leave. Lin Li shook his head slightly, stood up, and walked towards the window. He then pushed the window open and looked out. He calmly said, "They're just a bunch of archmages. They're far from being able to scare me." What archmages?" asked the chubby owner, who had never left the small town, and thus wasn't clear about mages and the likes. However, he was somewhat relieved when he heard that Lin Li didn't intend to escape. Still, he thought about it and realized that if the two parties got into a fight, they would definitely smash plenty of items. It seemed that he would still be doomed. At the thought of this, the chubby owner's expression changed again, and he extended his fingers that were each as thick as a mallet, calculating the gains and losses of his business with a look of dismay. Although the handful of gold coins was not a small sum of money, and was enough for him to build a few more of such inns, he would be able to earn more money if he didn't make any losses. They had already damaged 2 windows and 1 door. If the people outside were to rush in again, the tables, chairs, and floor. "Get out!" Lin Li barked sternly at the window, but his volume wasn't too loud, and it seemed like he was just talking to someone who was in front of him. In fact, it was a little softer than that. The chubby owner who was calculating the gains and losses was suddenly frightened, and even began shivering. Thinking that Lin Li was speaking to him, he quickly put his hands behind him. However, when he looked up, he discovered that Lin Li was looking out the window, after which there was a sudden shriek coming from outside. To ordinary people like the chubby owner, there was nothing too surprising about Lin Li's bark, but to the mages outside, it made them feel as if their souls were in a vortex full of lightning and thunder. The unparalleled power seemed to be tearing their souls. Although they didn't even hear Lin Li's voice, there was a terrible pain spreading from the depths of their souls. Everyone, including Charles, couldn't help but wail in agony as they immediately knelt to the ground with their hands on their heads. In fact, it was just a very simple magical roar of the soul, which mages who practiced mental spells would be able to learn at level 5 or level 6. In the eyes of many mages, the effect of that spell was rather weak, and it would at most cause the opponent to lose consciousness for a moment. The success rate was rather low too. However, there was a certain characteristic of roar of the soul. There was no upper limit in the demand for mental strength, which also meant that the stronger the user's mental strength, the greater the power of that magic spell. If other legendary mages were to let out a roar of the soul at this moment, they might only cause those wizards to be stunned for a moment, but they would not be able to cause substantial damage. However, Lin Li was already at the peak of level 24, and his mental strength was already of the sanctuary level. He was actually already showing those mages some mercy by choosing not to make their souls dissipate with the roar of the soul. The group of menacing mages were still clamoring about tearing down the inn just now, and yet they were all holding their heads with their hands, and screaming loudly on the ground. The sight gave the chubby owner a great shock, and he looked at Lin Li like Lin Li was a ghost. However, he also secretly felt thankful for the fact that the young mage Lin Li did not care about honorifics and formalities. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to take a scolding from Lin Li at all, let alone a beating. "Okay, it's alright. Go ahead and get busy." Lin Li turned his head smilingly as if he had just done a trivial thing. "Ah, in that case, I'll go downstairs. If you need anything, feel free to call me," the chubby owner said before fleeing from Lin Li's room like he was escaping a disaster. "Oh my god, who are the people who have come to stay in my inn all these years? Are they all so terrifying? Seems like I should find a chance to sell this inn to someone else. This business may be profitable, but it's too dangerous." After the chubby owner left, Lin Li still remained standing in front of the window. However, he was looking at the town in the distance instead of the people on the ground. Soon, a figure flew from outside the town and landed directly among the mages outside the inn. He was a mage who seemed to be a middle-aged man. Although he had restrained some of his magical waves, he was still exuding the powerful aura of a legendary mage. The legendary mage who had just arrived glanced at the people, who were moaning on the ground, and couldn't help but frown. He looked up at Lin Li, who was standing in front of the window, and said in a deep voice, "You must be President Fulik of the Tower of Dusk. They all say that the president of the Tower of Dusk is cruel and relentless. Now that I've seen you, the rumors are indeed true. Don't you think you have gone a little overboard?" "I was already showing mercy to the ones who provoked me," Lin Li said indifferently. Showing mercy? The middle-aged mage seemed to be holding back his anger as he pointed at the mages on the ground while glowering at Lin Li. "Is this what you mean by showing mercy? Their mental strength has already been permanently destroyed. Does showing mercy mean severing their hopes of making progress in magic? Haha, isn't this merciful compared to killing them?" Of course, Lin Li knew how serious it was for mages, but since it was a punishment, it definitely had to hurt. Besides, He could tell from the clamoring of those people just now that they were extremely hostile to the Tower of Dusk, and he simply did not kill because they were on the territory of the Ashen Warlock. Great, great. It's no wonder that you're the president of the Tower of Dusk, but don't forget who the owner of this place is. I believe he will do us the Mithril Alliance some justice, said the middle-aged mage. He did not attack Lin Li recklessly despite being infuriated. It was because he was held back by the presence of the Ashen Warlock, and also because he could tell that he couldn't deal with Lin Li alone. The Mithril Alliance was originally composed of 13 families. At the end of the Dark Age, the battle with the Blood Moon clan, and some other unknown factors resulted in the destruction of 7 major families. Soon afterwards, the Caesar family, who were the founders of the Mithril Alliance, withdrew from the alliance. Hence, there were only 5 families left to support the alliance. Although there were only 5 families left, the Mithril Alliance was still a top force in the breezy plains. The middle-aged mage was Joseph Taylor, the current patriarch of the Taylor family, which was one of the 5 major families. At the same time, he was also the leader of the alliance for the past 10 years. Although Joseph didn't see Lin Li attacking, he could feel the huge tremor coming from his soul when he rushed over just now. They all said that the president of the Tower of Dusk had level 23 powers and abilities. However, Joseph could tell from his personal experience just now that the overwhelming mental strength was definitely beyond level 23. Patriarch Joseph, you must avenge us, said Charles, who had heard Joseph and Lin Li's conversation, and knew what kind of predicament he and his mages would face. His face instantly turned pale. Although they were not all the mages that the family had, their disability would be a huge loss for them, and causing such a huge loss, all of a sudden would definitely make him lose his position as the leader, which he had just been promoted to lately. Upon sight of the pale-faced mages who were getting up from the ground, Joseph felt as if his heart was bleeding. The 5 major families today were not living too well, and the decrease in talents was their biggest problem currently. However, the tens of mages whom they had placed high hopes on were now ruined by Lin Li in the blink of an eye. That was adding fuel to the fire, and making things worse for the Mithril Alliance. Although the mages were all members of the Dida family, which Charles was from, Joseph understood that the damage done to the mages would implicate him too. Staring at Charles, who was tugging the sleeves of his robe, a look of disgust and abhorrence formed in Joseph's eyes. If it weren't for the fact that the former patriarch of the Dida family had been devoured when he was summoning the abyssal demon dragon, how could Charles have had the chance to take over as the patriarch? The members of the Dida family, who wanted to control puppets, probably wouldn't get the chance to, either. Although useless puppets were easier to control, they were prone to ruining things. However, there were rules in the alliance, and even the leaders could not intervene with the internal affairs of the family of the members. Joseph took a deep breath and said, "Don't worry, I think the Ashen Warlock will handle this matter in a fair and just manner." Yeah, I didn't expect that he actually dared to do that in the territory of the Ashen Warlock. On the account of the relationship between the Ashen Warlock and the Dida family, he will definitely not let him and his Tower of Dusk go, said Charles, who seemed to have already thought of the scene of the Tower of Dusk being destroyed by the Ashen Warlock. Not only did Joseph feel even more contemptuous after hearing Charles' words, even the mages who had gotten up began to look pale and horrified. The relationship Charles mentioned was actually the request for some special herbs from the Dida family that the Ashen Warlock had once made. However, the Ashen Warlock had never owed others favors. Hence, after the matter was solved, he gave the Dida family a magical spell that could summon the abyssal demon. The value of the spell could be said to be far higher than the herbs that he had asked for. As long as it was used well, it would be able to increase the strength of the Dida family quickly. It did make sense. A legendary powerhouse actually managed to summon a legendary level abyssal demon and make him his subordinate. What about 2 or 3 of them? Then, of course, the summoning was not easy, and in order to make the summoned abyssal demon recognize oneself as its master, one would first have to have the strength to defeat it. Otherwise, it would be courting death. Unfortunately, Daniel, the former patriarch of the Dida family, was too greedy when summoning the abyssal demons, and he even wanted to summon the powerful abyssal demon dragon. As a result, he managed to summon the powerful abyssal demon dragon, but it was totally unwilling to obey him. Not only did the abyssal demon dragon turn him into ashes, it even nearly destroyed the entire Dida family. If it weren't for the Ashen Warlock's intervention and the capturing of the abyssal demon dragon, there would probably have only been 4 families left in the Mithril Alliance. After Daniel's death, the Dida family began to fight and vie with each other for power again. As a result, they reached a truce, and the outcome was to let Charles, a man who was good for nothing except his magical talent, take the throne of the Dida family patriarch. However, Charles' magical talent was now gone, and he could really be considered useless. When he returned, he he would probably be thrown off the throne of the patriarch which he had occupied for merely 2 years. Joseph quietly shifted his gaze onto the upper floor of the inn, only to see that the window was closed. Feeling a sense of relief, he turned his head around and said, "Charles, you can walk, can't you? For the sake of your safety, you'd better stay in the camp until we meet Ashen Warlock. Don't provoke the people from the Tower of Dusk anymore." "Yes, Patriarch Joseph, I know," Charles said while hanging his head low with a tinge of resentment in his eyes. After all, he was now the patriarch of the Dida family, yet Joseph actually called him by his name. Was he really going to be stripped of his position as patriarch once he went back? Joseph walked in front and led everyone to the camp outside the town, but he didn't stop pondering in his head. It was actually not a bad thing for Charles' magical talent to be ruined. In 2 years, it will be the Dida family's turn to become the leader of the Alliance. If the Mithril Alliance was really handed over to Charles the Idiot, it would truly be a disaster. If the Dida family were to get up to any nonsense again this time, Joseph felt that it would be better to unite with the other 3 families to get rid of the jinx and troublemaker. The power of the young president of the Tower of Dusk was indeed extraordinary, and even if he didn't seem to be level 24, he should be at the peak of level 23. Besides, he also had 2 undead servants. Even though the Mithril Alliance could deal with him alone, they would still have to put in plenty of effort. Fortunately, they had roped the other 2 families in this time. In the small inn, Lin Li had long been sitting at the table and continuing to read the historical biography quietly when Joseph and the rest left. Due to the fact that he did not know the Ashen Warlock well, he dared not take the risk and read the Book of Eternity there. After all, the Ashen Warlock was a powerhouse who was on the same level as the 3 arbitrators. His experience in the Big Rift and fighting Rod Hart allowed him to find out how terrifying a sanctuary powerhouse was. Even if he had all 7 pieces of the debris of the stars, it would still be impossible for him to fight them at this time. During dinner time, the inn became lively again. However, unlike before, there were new guests at the inn. Lin Li took a seat in the restaurant downstairs and was drinking some juice and eating some barbecue. His 2 undead servants didn't have to eat anything. If Norfaller were to drink fresh blood, he might just end up frightening the civilians in the town. Hence, they decided to just stand behind Lin Li. Among the new guests of the small inn, there were warriors, mages, and humans who exuded some slight menace of the dragon. However, they all shared a similar characteristic: they had the aura of a legendary powerhouse. However, after everyone entered, they still couldn't help but cast a look of surprise at Lin Li. After all, there were 2 legendary servants standing behind him, which was absolutely daunting. However, after seeing the appearance of Lin Li and the 2 undead servants, the people suddenly realized that Lin Li was the young president of the Tower of Dusk who had become a legendary mage in his early 20s, and had 2 loyal legendary level undead servants who followed him around. That was no secret in the breezy plains. Lin Li knew without having to guess that those people had to be the leaders of the top forces in the breezy plains invited by the Ashen Warlock. However, those people knew each other well, while Lin Li didn't recognize any of them. He only knew Joseph, whom he had a feud with and bore grudges against. Hence, he continued to have his own dinner. "Haha, Masterfullick, I knew you'd be invited this time too." All of a sudden, Lin Li heard a familiar voice, which made him raise his head and look at the gate, only to see a fat man, who was several times fatter than the chubby owner, walking towards him. It turned out to be the president of the Glitter Gold Trade Union, Hoffman. "Mr. Hoffman, how did you? Oh, I didn't expect to see you here. Please have a seat." Lin Li initially intended to ask Hoffman how he ended up there, but he decided that it would be a little strange to ask the question since the Glitter Gold Trade Union was also one of the top forces of the breezy plains. Hence, there was nothing strange about Hoffman showing up here. Although Lin Li was not bothered by the numerous hostile gazes that were being shot at him, he was still glad to be able to run into an acquaintance. Lin Li stood up and gave his seat to Hoffman before telling Norfaller to clean up the dishes on the table. He then said to Hoffman, "Mr. Hoffman, I'm really glad to see you here." "Haha, I guessed it a long time ago. Roland must have invited you this time. By the way, I heard about you going to the Brilliance Shrine and Darkness Shrine. I've also heard that you gave that dead-faced Syndros a pharmaceutics journal," Hoffman said as he began to chat with Lin Li excitedly. The leaders of the various top forces were still getting ready to step forward and greet Hoffman when he entered, but no one thought that the fat man, who was usually amicable and talkative, would simply brush them off perfunctorily and go straight to the president of the Tower of Dusk. Hoffman's bewildering behavior gave everyone a great shock. They all thought that the Glitter Gold Trade Union and the Tower of Dusk had merely shared an ordinary cooperative relationship, but it now seemed that things might not be that simple. In particular, Joseph of the Mithril Alliance was filled with dismay when he saw that scene. He initially planned to unite with the Glitter Gold Trade Union to suppress the business of the Tower of Dusk, but it now seemed that he ought to be more careful. If the Glitter Gold Trade Union were to provide a large amount of funds for the Tower of Dusk, it would be even more difficult for him to execute his plan. "It's too noisy here. Let's go to the room and talk there instead," Lin Li said. When he heard Hoffman asking about pharmaceutics, he got up and invited him to the room to talk. Of course, it was not actually noisy, but rather that Lin Li didn't want to teach his enemies about pharmaceutics. Almost everyone present apart from Hoffman was an enemy of the Tower of Dusk. "Oh, sorry, I was too anxious." Hoffman stood up with a smile, looked at the people around him, and followed Lin Li upstairs. He then whispered, "Masterfulek, I heard that the Tower of Dusk has encountered some problems lately. If you need help from the Glitter Gold Trade Union, feel free to let me know. I can't guarantee anything else, but if you need any financial aid, we'll definitely be able to cooperate." Upon sight of Lin Li's and Hoffman's silhouettes that were gradually disappearing at the end of the stairs, the people at the bottom finally recovered from the shock. Although the people present were not much weaker than the Glitter Gold Trade Union, they had to admit that in terms of wealth, no one could compare to the Glitter Gold Trade Union. President Mogadi, 1. Patriarch Clause. I've already prepared a room for your discussion. I think we have to have an in-depth discussion about the issue of facing the Tower of Dusk, said Joseph, who was the person in charge of the Mithril Alliance, to President Mogadi of the Blood Moon clan on behalf of the 4 other families. The cooperation of the 3 forces had already begun long ago. Otherwise, it wouldn't have resulted in almost all the forces of the Breezy Plains going against the Tower of Dusk. However, things were not ideal and did not go according to plan lately. Although they had brought certain losses to the Tower of Dusk, the losses were clearly still within the tolerance of the Tower of Dusk. After seeing how enthusiastic Hoffman was towards Lin Li, Mogadi and Claus had some more doubts about the cooperation led by the Mithril Alliance. In terms of business, the difficulty of destroying the Tower of Dusk would be rather high once the Tower of Dusk had the financial support of the wealthy Glitter Gold Trade Union. What else is there to talk about? We followed your previous plan, but we haven't gotten any benefits yet. Instead, we lost a lot of money. It seems that the Glitter Gold Trade Union is going to support the Tower of Dusk this time. I can't think of any force that might have more money than the Glitter Gold Trade Union. I'm afraid we might not end up getting anything, said Mogadi, who was obviously dissatisfied with Joseph's previous plan. Haha, President Mogadi, where has the pride of the dragon and your bloodline gone? They're just a small force that has just been established for 2 or 3 years. Yet you're already losing confidence, Joseph said in a disdainful tone. Mogadi, the president of the Blood Moon clan, had the blood of both Wyrm and human in his body, which was the reason Joseph tried to provoke his pride. In fact, Mogadi did not have the ability to transform into a real dragon. Despite carrying the blood of Wyrm, his body would only be covered with solid dragon scales after his Wyrm genes were awakened. He would also have strong magical defense and physical capabilities. At the same time, he would also possess strong physical power that was not inferior to that of the Wyrm. He would even be able to spit out dragon breath, and thus could be considered a hybrid between a human and Wyrm. Small force. Would a small force be invited by the Ashen Warlock? Starting 3 years ago, they developed from nothing to the great force that they are now. They're so well developed that you even want to destroy them. I do admire that young man, actually. By the way, I heard that there's a young, ingenious patriarch in the Mithril Alliance too. Why haven't I seen him around today? Asked Mogadi, who didn't fall for Joseph's spitting, and instead made fun of Joseph, using the puppet patriarch of the Dida family. 1. No idea why, but the author consistently calls him a president, not a patriarch. Maybe a mistake, maybe not. Lately, Charles has been showing signs of a breakthrough, and he is focusing on learning and practicing magic. Hence, he will not be attending this gathering. Let's talk about the Tower of Dusk. President Mogadi, don't you want that land that produces the serum grass anymore? Joseph asked with his brows slightly raised. However, his calm words struck a sour note within Mogadi, the president of the Blood Moon clan, and instantly left him speechless. Joseph continued, even if the Glitter Gold Trade Union supports him, will they really give it their all? Will they really do their best? In my opinion, the Glitter Gold Trade Union is probably greedier than we are. The core members of the Blood Moon clan all had mixed bloodlines like Mogadi. In addition to those who were hybrids of Wyrms and humans, there were also some who were hybrids of high elves and humans, as well as prehistoric magical beasts and humans. However, at the same time that the mixed bloodline brought them great strength, it brought about endless pain and agony for them. When they were still in the Blood Moon clan regiment, there were special potions formulated by the High Elves to help them suppress the pain. However, after the fall of the High Elves, there were no longer such special potions. Many of the members of the Blood Moon clan, who escaped the catastrophe, even committed suicide because they couldn't bear the pain. It was not until later that the Blood Moon clan unearthed a High Elven relic and obtained the formula of that special potion, which helped to resolve the issue. Through the research of the formula of the potion, they also discovered that the potion played a vital role in mixing bloodlines and genes, but it required a dosage that was more than 100 times higher in order to suppress the pain. However, the most important herb of the formula was the serum grass, which required an extremely harsh environment for growth. The serum grass that the Blood Moon clan could obtain through various channels was not enough for the formulation of the pain-suppressing potions, let alone to create new members of mixed bloodlines. In the vast breezy plains, the place that had an environment that was the most suitable for the growth of serum grass was a swamp to the west of Garland. However, the swamp belonged to the Tower of Dusk. Actually, if it had just been a swamp where serum grass grew, the Blood Moon clan would have first thought of asking for it directly from the Tower of Dusk. After all, serum grass might be precious, but it was not of much use to pharmacists. However, the problem was that, wherever serum grass grew, there would inevitably be a large number of magical metal ores, which were something that the Tower of Dusk definitely wouldn't give up. At the same time, the Blood Moon clan couldn't afford it, either. You mean, the Glitter Gold Trade Union wants to swallow the entire Tower of Dusk and encroach on its land? Claus asked in slight disbelief. Upon hearing his words, Mogadi remained silent. If the swamp were to fall in the hands of the Glitter Gold Trade Union, there would be no difference between that and the Tower of Dusk having the ownership of the swamp. The greatest difference was that the Blood Moon clan would have a tougher time obtaining the swamp. It's not like you guys haven't seen Hoffman, that cunning fatty. When he smiles at you, it means that he has already cut off a piece of your flesh. Think about it carefully. How could the Glitter Gold Trade Union give the Tower of Dusk money for nothing? If the Tower of Dusk ends up failing to repay the loan, they would have to. Joseph sneered as if the Tower of Dusk had really fallen into the hands of the Glitter Gold Trade Union. Joseph's words undeniably made some sense. If the Glitter Gold Trade Union were to end up encroaching on the Tower of Dusk, their plans would end up in vain, as they would just be paving the way for others. At the thought of this, Mogadi and Claus nodded unanimously and agreed to Joseph's invitation. The Mithril Alliance has sent me an invitation. Lin Li suddenly received an invitation from the Mithril Alliance as the date set by the Ashen Warlock got closer. Although Lin Li had not interacted with any other forces except Hoffman, whom he chatted with from time to time, in the past 2 days, he knew that the Mithril Alliance was the root of the recent boycott that the Tower of Dusk had been facing. In a room which was arranged like a conference room, Lin Li saw Joseph, whom he had met once. Joseph was the only one in the room, and the two greatest allies of the Mithril Alliance, the Blood Moon clan and the Caesar family, did not send their representatives. President Flick, please have a seat, Joseph said while remaining seated, and pointing at the seat opposite him, with an expressionless face. Lin Li walked over indifferently, pulled the chair out, and took a seat. He then leaned back nonchalantly while staring at Joseph, who was opposite him with a look of derision in his eyes. However, Joseph did not seem to have the intention to speak. Joseph and Lin Li looked at each other for a while, and the former finally couldn't endure it anymore. President Flick, let's put aside everything that happened 2 days ago. This time, I invited you here because I want to discuss with you the Tower of Dusk. I'm sorry, but did I hear you wrongly? Even the Supreme Council has given the Tower of Dusk absolute autonomy. Hence, it seems that you are in no place to meddle with the affairs of the Tower of Dusk, Lin Li said mockingly. A sullen gaze formed in Joseph's eyes, but he didn't lose his temper. Instead, he shook his head slightly and said, if it's just the internal affairs of the Tower of Dusk, we naturally have no right to interfere, but now it concerns the interests of the Breezy Plains. As the representatives of the various forces of the Breezy Plains, we, the Mithril Alliance, can't sit back and do nothing? Okay, I will hear what advice you have for me, Lin Li said with folded arms. He leaned back against the chair with a relaxed expression on his face as if he were waiting to watch a show. The development of the Tower of Dusk in the past 2 years was indeed amazing. If the Tower of Dusk hadn't been in the Breezy Plains, we might have been able to become partners, Joseph said with admiration, but his tone soon changed. He austerely continued, however, this is the Breezy Plains, and the development of the Tower of Dusk has already affected the peace that has been maintained for thousands of years in the Breezy Plains. I'm afraid you can't deny that the Tower of Dusk was built on the corpses of other forces, President Flick. The survival of the fittest is a natural law. Life and death is a natural process of life, and there would be a rise and fall for every force and authority. Even the prosperous High Elves dynasty was overthrown. As the leader of the Mithril Alliance, you probably don't need me to teach you that logic, do you, Mr. Joseph? Lin Li retorted in a hostile manner. Although he knew that Joseph was just trying to find a reason to bring up the topic of his agenda, Lin Li decided to play along. Yes, the survival of the fittest is indeed the perpetual law of nature in this world, Joseph said while clenching his fists which were tucked in his sleeves. However, He did not show much emotion on his face. First he nodded in agreement, and then continued, however, President Flick, you must not forget that in the breezy plains, there is a hierarchy above the laws of nature, and that is the will of the Ashen Warlock. The rapid development of the Tower of Dusk has broken the peace that the breezy plains has enjoyed for thousands of years, which is exactly against the will of the Ashen Warlock. I reckon you probably don't need me to tell you the fate that those who go against the will of the Ashen Warlock will suffer. You should have heard it. This time, the Tower of Dusk may have been invited by the Ashen Warlock, but do you really think you can stand up to us? Oh, in that case, why do you think the Ashen Warlock invited me, Mr. Joseph? Lin Li questioned, pretending to be worried. However, he was actually amused. Obviously, Joseph had no choice but to reveal his agenda even though he made himself out to be so high-sounding at the start. Since you've already guessed it, why bother making me state things explicitly, President Flick? However, there is still some room for compromise, said Joseph, who felt a little confused after seeing Lin Li's expression. He felt that Lin Li seemed to behave differently from the rumors. However, after thinking about how terrifying the Ashen Warlock was, and the fear that he felt towards him, Joseph reckoned that no matter how bold and brazen Lin Li was, he would definitely feel some fear. Is there? Lin Li continued to keep up his pretense while revealing some nervousness and anticipation on his face. He began to sit up, and stopped leaning against the chair as well. That would depend on your choice. Will you choose your own life, or the Tower of Dusk that will bring you big trouble? If you are willing to give up the Tower of Dusk, the Mithril Alliance will give you a hand when you're facing the Ashen Warlock. Joseph initially wanted to say that he could let Lin Li join the Mithril Alliance, but he was worried that he could not control Lin Li, and would end up imposing a threat on themselves. Do you mean that you want me to give up the Tower of Dusk and give it to the Mithril Alliance? Haha, unfortunately, you can't sink your teeth into the Tower of Dusk even though you have a huge appetite, Lin Li said as he leaned back against the chair again. He no longer appeared nervous, and was looking at Joseph with contempt. Despite knowing that he had been tricked, Joseph didn't get angry. Instead, he sneered and said, it seems that President Flick has already made a choice. It's such a shame. With your talents, I'm afraid you can achieve huge accomplishments wherever you go. However, the breezy plains is not for you. It's not for you to decide whether it's suitable or not. However, I'm a little curious. I heard that the Mithril Alliance, the Blood Moon clan, and the Caesar family are allied, but you asked to meet me alone. Mr. Joseph, aren't you afraid of letting them find out? Asked Lin Li, who began meditating because he had lost interest in the discussion. You don't have to worry about this, President Flick. I believe you will receive their invitation soon, but I think I already have the answer to the outcome of their invitation, Joseph said as he remained seated with a straight face, not intending to see Lin Li off at all. Just as Joseph mentioned, Lin Li indeed received the invitation from the Blood Moon clan, shortly after he returned to his room. Actually, the Blood Moon clan was not as greedy as the Mithril Alliance, but their appetite definitely wasn't small. The Blood Moon clan was planning to ask the Tower of Dusk to vacate the swamp in the west of Garland, in exchange for their promise to never unite with the Mithril Alliance to go against the Tower of Dusk in the future.
Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share and subscribe. Have a great day.